Lo and behold, about 10 years later, whenever we started trying for a family, it turned out that that experience had actually caused more problems than we had realized.
That was Haley. 10 years before she ever really even thought about having a baby, she experienced some medical issues. Medical issues that, at the time anyway, really had nothing to do with reproduction. But as she just alluded to, when it did come time to try for a baby, she realized that there were going to be some complications. Today, Haley's going to share how she came to find out she'd need help and how she managed to overcome all obstacles to reach her goal. I'm Shannon Zuber with Progyny, and this is Infertility. Hi everyone, thank you for joining us today. Before we dive into Haley's story, I just want to take a second to remind you that we have some resources available for anyone who may want to bring fertility and family building programs to their employer at progyny.com/talktohr. Progyny, for those who may not know, is a benefit that employers can offer to their employees, and we help with preconception, fertility, pregnancy, postpartum, and menopause. If you're curious about bringing Progyny to your employer, you should visit progyny.com/talktohr. There, you'll get information you need, and hopefully we can get the ball rolling. Okay, we teased the background of Haley's story a little bit there at the open, but let's get into the full thing.
When I was 19, my appendix actually ruptured, and I had complications from that, and stemmed from needing to have couple surgeries after that. I had sepsis from it, was in the hospital for a while. And so it was a big ordeal my freshman year of college. And then so luckily recovered, thought everything was okay. And it was one of those things I was just really ready to put behind me. But lo and behold, about 10 years later, whenever we started trying for a family, it turned out that that experience had actually caused more problems than we had realized.
Haley's appendix ruptured during her freshman year of college, and as she said, at the time, she didn't think much of it from a reproductive perspective. And so she just carried on with college, and it was her junior year when she met the guy who would become her husband.
And we actually got paired up for a duo project together, and he drew my name out of a bag to get us paired up to work with each other. And it was good that we paired up on a class because he's actually pretty quiet. And so I don't know that we ever would have really spoke with each other if that hadn't happened. But so we worked together for weeks on this project. A lot of the time I feel like we spent not working on the project and just talking to each other in the library and getting to know each other. And the rest is kind of history. We started dating after that and got married in 2017.
Yes, they got married in 2017, and then 3 years later, they were ready to start trying.
First month, it doesn't happen. I'm like, okay, that's normal. And then again and again and again, slowly I just started to realize, I'm like, I think something's wrong. But unfortunately, as I'm sure many women who have gone through this know, your OBGYN typically won't get involved or do anything until you've been trying for a full year if you're under a certain age. But by 6 months, the alarm bells were going off, and I was like, I think something's wrong. So I went ahead and pushed, and I had an appointment with my OBGYN in the fall of 2020. And I could tell she was like, oh, I think she's being a little bit anxious. But she went ahead, ran some blood tests to check for ovulation. The results weren't stellar on those, so we were like, for progesterone levels. So she's like, you can try Clomid if you would like. And so I opted to do that. And during that appointment, I did mention, I was like, do you think my tubes could be blocked? I had these issues when I was 19 with my appendix rupturing. Could scar tissue have done that because I had sepsis? And she was like, well, you could check, but it still kind of implied that, you're under the year mark. There's nothing to panic about at that point. So went ahead and did 2 rounds of Clomid, still not pregnant. And at that point, I was just starting to get more and more convinced that I'm like, I think something bigger is going on here. And so it was at about the 9-month mark of trying that I finally called and pushed and said, nope, I want to go see a specialist.
Haley was more than ready to move on from care from her OBGYN and into care with a fertility specialist, aka a reproductive endocrinologist. And now is a good time to remind you that if you're having difficulty, or really if you just want to get the opinion of a reproductive endocrinologist, you can go ahead and do that. The rule of thumb is to seek help after a year of trying if you're under 35 and 6 months of trying if you're 35 or older. But if you want to seek help on month 9, well, then you probably should.
And honestly, looking back in hindsight, it was one of the best decisions that I've ever made. So leading up until that point, I kind of felt like I was being crazy. Maybe I was being too anxious. Something actually wasn't wrong, and I was just freaking out. That first visit with him, it was the first time in the 9 months that I'd actually started to feel like, okay, I wasn't crazy. And I distinctly remember saying during our appointment, I was like, I think my fallopian tubes are blocked. And without hesitating, my doctor was like, I think you're right. And if I was in Vegas, I would bet on it. And so you never want something to be wrong, but it was really nice to have somebody acknowledge what I was saying, like, hey, I had all this happen. I'm wondering if this is what's going on. And he was like, yep, I think you're right on the money. And so after like our first meeting, he ordered some blood tests that they usually do, and then also an HSG scan to check my tubes. And sure enough, got in there during the scan, and any woman who's had an HSG scan I know probably can attest to the fact that they're not any fun. But my doctor, he was just so compassionate and sweet the entire time, and sure enough, both tubes blocked with scar tissue from my appendix. And it wasn't good news, but I remember actually I had the appointment and I was relieved to find out that, yes, I wasn't crazy, something was wrong. This tubes looked salvageable from the scan, so we were really hopeful, like, okay, looks like maybe surgery's on the horizon, but that wasn't something that I was unfamiliar with at that point after everything that had happened previously. And so I was really hopeful that, all right, we're going to go in and have this surgery, they're going to unblock them, and then hopefully I can conceive naturally. And so at that time, that was the goal.
Haley's doctor didn't do that kind of surgery, so Haley was referred out to another local surgeon.
So yeah, the initial surgery was to try to clear them. And so we went in, we were really hopeful. I was hopeful but terrified because, you know, a lot was riding on it. It was one of those things that's like either we are able to salvage these tubes or you're either looking at you have to do IVF, you're going to have to adopt, or you're going to have to make the decision not to have children. And all of that is terrifying to try to decide. Those are all big decisions. So we went in though and we were like, all right, this is going to work. And it ended up being a 6-hour surgery. Some other specialists got called in while I was under because my insides, to put it just kind of bluntly, were a mess. I had scar tissue everywhere from the appendectomy complications. And so in a way, it was a blessing getting in there and getting cleaned out, I feel like, because I think that helped pave the way for me to have a healthier pregnancy later on to get all that scar tissue out. But unfortunately, after 6 hours, the right tube just would not cooperate. The surgeon had mentioned she even spent an hour on that one, just flushing and flushing and flushing and trying to get it to clear, and it wouldn't. So they had to remove that one. And then unfortunately, the left tube, it looked okay, but the doctor couldn't get the dye to drain during the surgery. Thoughts were perhaps it was just swelling because they had been in there working for so long. So they went out to the waiting room, and my poor husband had to make the decision, talking with the surgeon. They were like, do you want us to leave it in and hope for the best, or go ahead and remove it? And so he knew that I really wanted to try naturally if we could. And so he opted to go ahead and have them leave it, and we were hoping it would heal up. And so that's what they did. And I was happy with that. I wanted to at least give it a shot. But later on, what ended up happening, so after you have the surgery, you have to heal for a few months, and then they bring you in for another HSG scan. And so we're kind of like holding our breath during this time, like, oh, did it work? And in the meantime, they give you the all clear. They're like, if you want to try at that time, you can. So I'm getting my hopes up during this time, like, oh, maybe it is unblocked and I'll get pregnant during these few months while we're waiting. But that obviously didn't happen. And then I went back in for my second HSG scan to see or not. And when we got in there, not only did we find out that the tube was still blocked, but I also had a hole where the right tube removal did not heal shut. And my doctor had said this is something that happens 1 in 200 times. So I was like, it's either 1 or 2 in 200 times. So it was a very, very rare complication. And I was just, so you're just devastated. I was like, not only did it not work, but now I have a hole that needs to be closed, and I have to go through another surgery to take the left one out because they won't do IVF if you have a blocked tube because it can be harmful to the embryo. So we went through all that and like months of surgical scheduling and everything just to kind of be back at, well, we've got to take them out.
I think it's safe to say that Haley has some pretty rough luck when it comes to medical things. So both tubes would be removed, and Haley knew that IVF was their best option to move forward.
As devastating as it was, we were just grateful of the fact that we're like, at least IVF is an option. Because if this had happened to me years in the past, like with women who have had things like this happen before IVF, like that's the end of the road. You can't have a baby. And so for us, it was very, very upsetting, but we were like, you know what, at least now we have a clear path, like this is what we got to do.
So they were moving forward with IVF. Now, IVF can be very expensive, and at the time that they did their retrieval cycle, they had no coverage for it, so they were out of pocket. But then, by the time they were ready to transfer an embryo, that actually changed, and they were able to access the Progyny benefit to help support their treatment through Haley's husband's employer.
So that's kind of the funny part. Yeah, so we did the retrieval cycle in November of 2021, and then we found out in January of 2022 that was when we had the fertility benefit. So we had already paid for the retrieval cycle. And so there was that kind of moment of just like, oh my gosh, we just missed it. But we were still so grateful because, yes, we had paid for the retrieval cycle, but transfer cycles for the embryos aren't cheap either. And so it was a moment of kind of like, whew, okay, we have help going forward, because I think a lot of people think, the journey ends after you get your embryos and everything, but it's like, oh man, that was just kind of when it got started for us. So it was really helpful having the Progyny benefit going forward after that, because there was a lot less pressure.
IVF can be a challenge, but having coverage and crucially having a great care team can really make everything significantly more manageable.
My quality of care at my clinic was excellent. I feel like quality of care is where skills and knowledge and compassion intersect with each other. And I feel like doctors that are working with fertility patients, you really have to be a special kind of person, because usually by the time people get to you, they're very shaken up. They are terrified about what the future is going to hold. And so I know that was the case with me. I was very, very scared. And my doctor was just so sweet, compassionate, very, very intelligent, knew what he was doing. And the one nurse, Janet, she was like, nope, you're going to give these shots to yourself. It's going to empower you. She had gone through IVF for her children, so she knew exactly what I was going through. And so she walked me through getting over my fear of needles, and I was able to give my shots all to myself during the retrieval cycle, and I wouldn't have been able to do that without her. And it really does. It kind of takes the fear away a little bit if you're like, okay, I can do this myself. It's not going to be that bad. Luckily, the needles are tiny, but there is a mental element that you got to get past whenever you're trying to give yourself a shot. It's a weird feeling.
Ever since freshman year of college, Haley has had some pretty hard luck when it comes to health and medical things. But fortunately, this IVF retrieval cycle went as smoothly as she could have imagined.
Yeah, so as far as the retrieval went, it was very smooth. Shots went well, and then I stemmed very, very well. And my doctor, I feel like he did a good job because he knew some of my blood results, like hormone levels, were a little bit wonky, for lack of a better term. And so I feel like he did a good job of really tweaking the meds to make sure that I had the best results possible. And we did. And so, yeah, it was one of the smoother parts of this whole journey.
So the egg retrieval went really well, and they were getting ready for a transfer when her husband got the news that his employer was now going to offer the Progyny benefit.
Started a transfer cycle in January, and then we ended up having to halt that. And so we were in limbo between that and starting another one, and that's when we found out that he had benefits. So I was already stressed out at that point because, you get through your retrieval and you think, okay, and then we'll have a transfer and everything will be okay. And it was starting off rocky. And so I was already shaken up at that point. I had surgeries leading up to that and then the retrieval. And so it'd been a very hectic medical year in 2021. And then we're starting off rocky in 2022. So just getting good news like that when it felt like news was kind of in place at that point, it was just such a relief to be like, okay, money is the one thing that I don't need to worry about now. I can just focus on the process and trying to be healthy and take care of myself in the meantime.
Okay, so they had embryos, they had coverage, and it all should be pretty straightforward from there. But unfortunately, they ran into another obstacle. Their transfer was canceled due to some fluid in her lining. So they needed to cancel that one and try again later.
Going in February, once again, the fluid is still there, and it was a pretty big pocket where they're like, we can't do anything. So then we were at a standstill at that point of, is this going to go away on its own? Should we take a break? And at one point there was talk of doing like a 5 or a 6 month break where I would take, I think, Lupron shots to just halt all hormones, hopes that it would go away. So I was just heartbroken at that point. I was like, I've gone through all of this. My process was a little longer than most too, because I had to have all the surgery. So I was just a mom. And so hearing that I was going to have to sit and wait for 5 more months, I was just beside myself. And so it was between doing the break, and then I was worried, well, what if we sit and wait and then the fluid is still there after that break, and then I'm right where I left or I started. And so, or doing surgery to see what was going on. So talked with my doctor, and ultimately he was like, all right, I do think surgery would be worth it to get in there and kind of look and see what's going on. And so ended up having another surgery in March of 2021. And luckily we did. And my fertility doctor was actually able to do that surgery. But when he got in there, there was polyps and fluid. And so he was able to clean all of that out and get me started off on a better foot. So had that surgery in March, rested for a little bit. And then in April, we started another transfer cycle. So at this point, I was just very shaken up because it's like I kept like starting cycles and then having the rug pulled out from underneath me and being like, okay, we got to stop now. So that cycle, luckily, did go okay. I got up to a transfer. We actually had a transfer on Cinco de Mayo, so we were just thrilled. It was one of the best days. And then unfortunately, a few days after the transfer, I got COVID. So we were just like, oh gosh. And so that was one of the scariest experiences ever, is waking up with a fever after you know that you've had an embryo placed. And so very nervous the whole time. Ended up, so had the transfer, wait, we go in to have the blood test, and I wasn't pregnant. And so there's always that moment of, was it because I got sick? Did it just not work? It's one of those things we'll never know. So that was a really rough grieving process getting through that. But we were like, it happens, unfortunately. And so, yeah, we grieved that process, but then we were ready to try again.
It was a very difficult time for the couple, but they and their doctor wanted to move ahead about a month later and try another transfer.
Luckily, that cycle went pretty good. No fluid. Went in. We were able to do the transfer. I'll never forget it. It was July 3rd whenever I had it. And so there was fireworks going off that day. It was a really good day. We're excited. And unlike the first time, it was the next day after the transfer. I was like, wow, I'm a lot more tired than I was the first time. And then within a few days, I think it was 2-3 days later, I woke up in the middle of the night and I was like, I feel weird. And I just kind of brushed it off. I was like, surely I wouldn't be feeling anything this early. And then the second time, I made it all the way to my blood test. The second time I was like dying, and I was like, I can't handle this. So I actually went in and got a pregnancy test. And so got it, came home. I remember I was just like, oh man, should I do this? Like, if it's negative, you're still going to be holding out hope because it's early, so it could be a false negative. But I was like, but if it's positive, then we're just going to be through the roof. And so went upstairs to our room, and I remember testing and waiting with my husband and looking down and seeing that it was positive. And after almost 2 years of a bunch of failures and everything, it was just kind of like, oh my gosh, this is actually happening. So probably one of the happiest moments of my life.
They were pregnant, and it was time to share the news.
So we actually just kept the news to ourselves for that day and just enjoyed it. And it's still, I remember being like, does this actually happen? And going back and looking at the test over and over. I'm like, yeah, it's positive. And then it was the next day, my parents were actually getting ready to go on a trip where they weren't going to have cell signal. And so I was like, oh, if I don't tell them now, then I'm not going to be able to tell them for a while. So we actually, and they weren't expecting for me to find out that early. They thought that my test was going to be at the clinic a few days later after they were already on the trip. And so it was fun. So we were able to surprise them and let them know, like, hey, I'm pregnant. And then called the clinic too, and then went in and confirmed with blood work and everything. So, and then it was funny, my husband's parents, I feel like they reacted a lot like he did, where they were kind of in shock for a moment, like, wait, this is actually happening? And kind of, it took them a little bit to soak it in.
Haley had been through a lot. Unexpected issues resulting from an appendix rupture a decade earlier had turned her family-building journey into a true challenge. But with the support of their community, their faith, their families, their doctors, and each other, they managed to reach their goal. Of course, they also had support from Haley's husband's employer through the Progyny benefit. A benefit like this one can really help make a challenging journey more manageable. So if you're interested in learning how you can help bring this benefit to your place of work, we have resources for you. You can learn more at www.progyny.com/talktohr. I want to thank Haley for joining us today and for sharing her story. I also want to thank you for listening. If you want to connect with us, you can do so on Instagram at This Is Infertility Podcast. If you want to follow Progyny, you can do so at Progyny Inc. Of course, if you're listening on a podcast app, please leave a rating and review. This Is Infertility is brought to you by Progyny. Please remember, this podcast is not intended to substitute for the personalized expert advice of your physician. I'm Shannon Zuber, and this is Infertility.